Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 25 today after the narrator's introduction of both the place and the people, Nabal and Abigail, that David is about to encounter. And so as we turn to verse 4, we'll hear many of the parallels that we've been noting between this chapter and chapter 24 and 26 surrounding it, and also between this chapter and the story of Jacob and Laban in Genesis, among other things. So let's begin, before we get into our passage, by reminding ourselves of that overall structure and seeing how it applies in our immediate passage. So we saw last time these elements here, the parallel with the Jacob and Laban story. Here we see the shalom, the invitation to shalom 3 times, as we'll hear, and then also the same thing of Jacob to Laban. And it's a very similar context, as we'll see, to Laban's shepherds and to Nabal, who has 3,000 sheep. And then we'll also see in this passage the invitation that Jacob has done no harm to Laban's sheep and that David has done no harm to Nabal's sheep. We'll get to these in the next video. There are also these links here between this chapter and the surrounding chapter, as we've been noting. Again, the shalom element is a factor here, and the verb for shalom in 24:19 is the only time it's used in 1 Samuel. And it's also around a question of compensation, which is the implicit thing of the shalom that David is inviting his men to give to Nabal, or at least to inquire about Nabal's shalom, is really more like it, in exchange for what he hopes will be a reward. And then also both Nabal, in a sarcastic way, and also Saul, in a fawning sort of way here, called David's son. And so that's highlighting the parallel there. Finally, we see here this question of lords, and Nabal will say, we won't see it today, but it's coming up. There are many servants today breaking away from their lords, and we see 27 of 38 uses of lord in 1 Samuel are in these chapters. There's also a parallel with the servants breaking away in the Jacob story, because that's exactly what Jacob is trying to do from Laban, is break away. But that's for next time. Another interesting aspect of 1 Samuel 25 is a series of triplets. We noted in chapter 24 there were a series of ABA chiasms in David's speech, where one line matched another line with a small intervention in it, a lot of little repetitions to try to slow down and emphasize what was going on. Here there's this whole series of triplets, and they're spread throughout the chapters, you can see, starting today with the triple call for peace or shalom that David sends his young men to Nabal with. And we'll see a whole series of those as we go. And then also this unit, once men begin to speak, or at least he tells them what they should say here in verse 6, this section forms a nice chiasm. And I haven't seen that other scholars have noted this chiasm, but here it is. If you're not familiar with chiasms, although they're found throughout the Bible, they have to do with the symmetrical pattern where the beginning and the end match and intersections match, and then there's a centerpiece. In this case, it's an A, B, C, D, C, B, A chiasm. A lot of them are 5-part, and as I was just noting in chapter 24, there are 3 parts, just A, B, A. But here we see the invitation to peace at the beginning, which is matched at the end of the outcome of evil, so the contrast between peace and evil. In verses 7 and 8, the witness that David sends his young men to Nabal to provide, that they did no harm to Nabal's sheep, and the young men themselves testifying. This is Nabal's young men. This is David's young men up here, and these are Nabal's young men affirming exactly what David's young men said. Then we'll see that Nabal turns against David and offers insults. And then after the center where David's young men turned away and came back, David turns against Nabal and notes that the young men told Abigail that your master shouted insults to us. And then that's the parallel. So we'll be working on that in the next couple of videos as we go. And then finally, with the keywords we're going to look at, and this has been modified since the one I posted last time, so if you happen to download that from the website, there's a newer version on there now, highlighting the use of young men, na'ar, in Hebrew 10 times in this section. And notice it'll contrast with when Nabal rejects the invitation to pay off David, whether that's blackmail or reciprocity, we'll look at in a minute. Then he turns away from the young man to his men. The men representing what some texts will call an army, although this is hardly a formal army. But certainly the seasoned people, those hundreds of people he found were dissatisfied and alienated, who are ready to take on whoever David calls them to take on. Perhaps the young men are sent here, and we see it so many times here, to highlight the apparently benign nature of the invitation, sending younger men. The word for young men can mean simply subservient. It doesn't have to refer to age, but it often can suggest people who are somewhere between children and adults. First, he sends the young men, as we'll see, with the invitation of peace. And all this around the theme of shearing, which we looked at last time, noting the 4 different sheep shearing passages in Genesis and in the books of Samuel that are those 4 are the only ones in the Bible, and how deeply connected they are. So I'll leave these key words up as we begin to enter in our passage. So starting here in verse 4, Foe notes below, as you can see, reading from an anthropological perspective, focusing on patron-client, he says, as a patron of his men in the wilderness, David attempts to create more bonds of asymmetrical reciprocity with potential clients in order to get access to new resources, human and material, and so expand his leadership. And that's one of the ways to interpret what is going on here, that David understands that if he's going to be king and he's going to have authority, he needs to have relationships with people out there. But one of the interesting questions is, which direction would this patron-client relationship go? As we already know, Nabal is a wealthy landowner, and in most situations, that's the kind of person who would become a patron to somebody else who needs the authority and power that Nabal is described as. And I remind that we saw last time he's not literally described as wealthy, he's simply described as a man of great power. So that's someone you would expect to work out a patronage relationship with. On the other hand, if David is going to become king, we might expect that a landowner like Nabal want to have the king as a patron. And certainly in the Roman Empire, kings were understood as patrons, reflecting the fact that the gods were the patrons and people were clients in that way. That's obviously a different social context than we have here in the David story, in the story world 1,000 years before the time of Jesus or so. But those kinds of relationships in social hierarchical societies have not changed much between David's time and Jesus' time, or really that much between Jesus' time and our time. So that's one of the ways we can look at this. Kings and wealthy landowners were in relationship in that time. We can see from way later in 2 Kings from these 2 examples, one around Josiah, who became king as a child, and one around his son. So let's look first at 2 Kings 21:24, where we hear this. But the people of the land killed all those who had conspired against King Amon, and the people of the land made his son Josiah king in place of him. And then just 2 chapters later, we hear 1 generation later, the people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, anointed him, and made him king in place of his father. The phrase people of the land in the Deuteronomistic history, especially in 2 Kings, can refer to 2 very different groups of people, so only context can determine. Here, it's plenty wealthy landowners, the sense of people of the land, of people who would own large agricultural estates or big ranchers like Nabal, as opposed to what are often described more specifically as the poor people of the land. Those are the people who are just the ordinary farmers and the folks who are left behind after Babylonian exile. So they would not be people in positions of power to influence the selection of kings as much as the wealthy landowners, also referred to as people of the land, which is probably a way to suggest they're just ordinary people, even though everybody who read the story would have known that they were actually the people behind the throne. So again, the patronage-client question can go both ways in those relationships. They make the person king, but then they rely on the king to provide benefits for them. While we're on that, we can also note there are 2 other ways to look at this. We look at it as its reciprocity, that David has provided a service and he's simply asking for payment. Granted, as we'll see, the service was not solicited by Nabal, but perhaps it's like in some situations in other parts of the world where people are poor, where people come up to your car at the intersection and propose to wipe your windows or to clean your car or to cut your grass or something because they're desperate. And if they asked you for permission to do it, you might say no, but now that they've done it, you're in a position of how can you turn down the fact that they did something for you. So that's another possibility, that he's providing an unsolicited service and asking for payment. But the darker possibility, as many scholars have suggested, this is like a Godfather element here. He's making Nabal an offer that Nabal better not refuse, which is to say, whether you call it blackmail or extortion threat, that this is a gentle offer that's shrouded in the potential violence. And of course, we know from what we see on the right side of the screen when the offer is turned down and David says 3 times the strap on their sword, that's certainly one way to read it. But all 3 ways are possible here. So before we reach a conclusion, let's go down a couple more verses and see what else we hear. So David heard in the wilderness, again echoing the long-distance messenger element here and reminding where we are. David and his men are in the wilderness of Paran, which is not on the map, but as scholars think somewhere down here. in the southwest area here, southeast area, I'm sorry. And Nabal is way up here in Maon where he lives, and his sheep are in Carmel. So that's a long way for this message to go. But David has established a network, and that message has come to him. But why are they telling him that? We know that the question of where Saul is and whether Saul is chasing him has been his theme for several chapters, and we certainly know why David would want to know where Saul is and why Saul wanted to know where David is. But Nabal is a new character in the story, and why would people be telling him, oh, by the way, Nabal is shearing his sheep? Well, perhaps it's because they know he needs a patron, or perhaps it's because this story isn't what it appears to be, a historical incident, but is to be understood, as we've looked at in the introduction and last video, as either an allegory where Nabal stands for Saul, and that's just another version of that same situation, or whether it's Saul's dream from chapter 26, where Yahweh put a deep sleep on him. And again, I won't try to resolve those right now. All those are possible. So he hears that Nabal is shearing his sheep, and as a result of that, he sends his men. 10 young men here. And as my note below has from Shields, who starts her article in this chapter with a reference to Godfather 2, and asking, is he Robin Hood or is he the Godfather? Addressing my same point from another angle. So he sends 10 young men, and he has 600, so this is clearly just a delegation to show some strength but not to overpower this landowner whom David has no existing relationship with. Although I noted last time from Chronicles and the end of 2 Samuel, there is some tenuous suggestion that there's a family relationship here, but we won't get into that now. So again, here's the reference, the first reference to the young men. And David said to the young men, giving them instructions here, and we'll see when he becomes king, he does a lot of giving instructions to people, although often to Joab, his general. Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name, or literally, ask in my name of his shalom, which is to say, not to give him my shalom, not to give him peace, but to ask basically, how are you doing? And that's exactly parallel to what Jacob does when he gets to the well in Laban's country, asking the shepherds at the well, how are they? And they answer with the word shalom. And so we certainly can see many parallels there. So ask in my name. Now, as my note below from Ellen von Wolde notes, the only place where Vishmi here, in my name, is placed between the preposition and la shalom, so that it seems as if David addresses Nabal directly, which is an interesting point here. David could, of course, gone directly, but instead he sends these young men to indicate that he's a person of some authority too, that he has a delegation who can speak on his behalf. And he tells them to speak this way, and this is what brings us right into the chiasm here, so we can bring that up. Peace be to you, peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. And as Boyle notes, he suggests this is a formula of diplomatic negotiations and invited Nabal into a pact with David. That's leaving aside the question of whether this is diplomatic negotiations between supposed equals, which would be awfully arrogant of David as a leader of a band of outcasts to suggest he's the social equal to a wealthy, prestigious landowner, or whether it's a patron-client, an unequal sort of set of relationships, whichever way we might imagine that unequal power is going. But this triple shalom here is understood as a formula: peace to you, to your house, and to all that you have, highlighting the emphasis on the property, which of course is really what David's interested in here. So continuing the sense that he's responding to what he's heard, he says here, and this will be echoed in verse 15, as my note says, I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us. And the reference to shepherds, of course, echoes the fact that David himself is a shepherd. Although we haven't seen him as a shepherd, it was his experience as a shepherd that led Saul to trust that he might have the skills to take on Goliath, not using the armor that Saul offered him, but using his shepherd's sling, as we well know in the Goliath story. So perhaps there's a class solidarity thing going on here, that David's shepherds and Nabal's shepherds recognize they're in the same level. They're working for a boss, although we don't know that David sees his young men in relation to him as a boss and employees, more like they're just a gang of people together with no particular hierarchy. But Nabal wouldn't necessarily hear it that way, of course, from his perspective. So your shepherds have been with us. Well, that's news. And as Falkman notes below, suggesting the pre-existing protection contract to which Nabal's young men refer in verse 16, and thus presenting the request as a bill that is due rather than a raw extortion demand. Further down here from Von Walde, she says, showing that he is sharing the shepherd's perspective. They, in their point of view, depended on David and his young men. However, at the same time, he intimates that he, David, and his men now depend on Nabal, saying something like I was saying from a different perspective. And he says, and we did them no harm, literally did them no disgrace, which is to say, did not dishonor them in any way, again, which on the other side of the chiasm, Nabal's young men will affirm. And they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. So now Nabal is expected to hear that behind his back, the stranger whom he doesn't know has been working with his own shepherds peacefully. Is it meant to be a combined rebellion against Nabal? In effect, that's what will happen. But would Nabal hear it that way? Does David intend it to be heard that way? We can't know. Although he next tells him as a witness to ask your young men and they will tell you. So if you don't believe me, a stranger, ask your own people and find out what they say here. Again, this is echoing David's asking Ahimelech for provisions in chapter 21 in the situation where he got Goliath's sword. The ask your young men brings up a nice play on words here because, of course, ask is Sha'al. So Sha'al your young men, as Bodner notes below, almost as if David is expecting an objection. And again, we hear from Diane Edelman, could reflect a godfather situation where no one would dare say anything bad about David for fear of reprisal. I hope you can hear from this range of scholarly comments that the reciprocity version, the Godfather extortion version, or the patronage version is pretty much equally shared among scholars. And although I've previously been committed to the Godfather version, I used to teach a class at Seattle University called King David Godfather. But now, having updated the scholarship and read the story even more closely, I think it's left wide open of which way we want to hear that. So ask your young men and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your sight, a standard biblical figure of speech for wanting to be in good relationship with somebody. Starting from a negative perspective, literally it's find favor in your eyes, which is to suggest the person asking is looking up socially to the other person. 47 times in the Masoretic text, and notice some of the interesting parallels, both to Jacob's message to Esau in a very different context. When he's afraid of Esau, we have no reason to think David is afraid of Nabal any time in the story, although some might suggest he should be, but he's not. And then we'll see later the question of finding favor in your sight earlier for David and Saul's sight, a little later for David and King Achish's sight of the Philistines, Joab in David's sight, David in Yahweh's sight, and finally Ziba in David's sight in 2 Samuel. So we'll see a whole series of finding favor in your sight. And it says, for you've come on a feast day, which is not a good translation, although it implies a feast. It's literally a good day, which implies feasting, as Samura notes from the book of Esther, which is a feast day, and as Hamilton notes, would make it a normal time for benefactions. The good day implies not necessarily a feast day like some religious holiday, but the sheep shearing time, which would, as I noted in the last video, would have been a time for great feasting, as well as drinking, which will happen in the event here and also happens in the event in 2 Samuel when Absalom counts on Amnon getting drunk. So please give, and this is one of the rare times where the New RSV includes the Hebrew piece na as please. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David. It's polite, but is it the fist in the velvet glove? It's hard to say. Nabal will have to make the decision of whether this polite invitation to give whatever you have at hand is actually some form of polite blackmail. To your son David, and having presenting himself via his messengers to Nabal, this wealthy landowner, who he must know his reputation because his very name that people call him is Fool, is quite the invitation to suggest that Nabal would receive him as a son, which is also perhaps a patronage invitation, that Nabal would be father and David would be son, much like in many ways people, especially in New Testament times, understand God as father, as a patron to people, providing what people need in exchange for putting trust in God, which is part of the patron-client relationship, that the client trusts in the patron to provide what the client can't provide for themselves. So it concludes here with the message being over, and David's young men came, and they said all this to Nabal in the name of David. Then they waited. And notice, we don't hear it said. It's not repeated here. In Genesis, a number of times, people give instructions to messengers, like Abraham does to his trusted servant in Genesis 24, to go back to the old country to talk to Laban to try to find a wife for Isaac. But there we hear Abraham's version of the story, and then we hear the servant's retelling. And as people like Meyer Sternberg have helped us to understand over the last 4 decades, when stories are repeated either by the narrator or a character in the Hebrew Bible, it's really important to pay attention to what changes are made. But here we don't hear anything. Here we just simply hear it of David telling his young man, and the narrator simply tells us that they repeated it. So it's an interesting leaving out of whether they tell it exactly as David said it. And then they waited, which is also an unusual thing here. And as Halverson and Holmes note, as sometimes happens with extortion rackets, one particularly proud owner refuses to comply. The note that they waited here, using the Hebrew navak here, as Falkman notes, this choice of words, which is unique in respect of messengers, is a climax, and the retardation intensifies the tension and teases our patience and creates uncertainty, which is to say we have to wait at the same time as they wait. And we will wait till next video to find out what Nabal has to say to this invitation to reward these shepherds. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.